Gut, also vielen Dank für die Einladung. Ich werde heute auf Englisch präsentieren, weil ich mich ja noch präziser auf Englisch ausdrücken kann. Und nachher können wir so anschließend eine Diskussion auf Deutsch führen, wenn das nötig ist. So today I'd like to actually talk about precision and of course its opposite, which is imprecision, or in fact the art of constructing precisely in the face of many unknowns. If you're all nerds like me, which I probably think you are, you'll be zooming in very, very much when you're drawing in AutoCAD, for example, zooming in until you can't zoom in anymore, just to see that the lines are truly intersecting. Because really that last fraction of the millimeter, that really counts. But then we go to the job site, and this is the material we're working with, right? Hot, heavy globs of mess. Here poured over the piping for this Balta-aktivierte system, or the TABS system. And at every step of that process, we're constantly confronted with degrees of precision and also imprecision. Even here on the other end of the spectrum, in the very controlled setting of a factory, with the machines and digital tools that very precisely mill each window component, much of it is still finished by hand. And we also can't forget that wood itself is a living material that changes with the weather, it expands, it contracts, it varies from piece to piece, cut to cut. And then these windows that were so, precisely made have to come back to here, where there's more hot globs of mess. So the precision of the windows, has to negotiate these kind of uneven surfaces of concrete here with these clips that essentially lift the windows above the roughness of the concrete in order to approximate a straight line. And of course, if we go back again to the concrete, to these walls, here's a flying one that's being held up while it cures. Again, a mess of scaffolding. And we imagine, in the comforts of our offices, that what we do and the end results are ultimately super precise. That construction is about intricate details and the battle of the millimeters. But in fact, the best executed buildings are maybe not so much about precisely executed details as they are about anticipating tolerance, anticipating the unknown, about understanding that there's a certain amount of unpredictability that we cannot avoid, even before construction starts. Sometimes that's through a budget cut, or maybe a supplier that we didn't choose because it's an open public tender and the lowest bid wins, and we have to live with these, subpar products. Or other times it's because perhaps the imprecisions of the job site, where we can be very happy if one end of a concrete wall is only 1 centimeter away from the other end of a concrete wall. So all of these contingencies, in a way, are part of the process that always comes to disrupt the perfect detail. But perhaps that's where the problem lies. Perhaps there's no precision and no perfection. Perhaps the best way to go may not be to fight all these contingencies at all, but rather to embrace them. This is not to say that we aim to be imprecise, but rather that we try to understand the way materials behave, the stages of construction, and the many scales of precision in order to incorporate the necessary tolerances, planned imprecisions, precise imprecisions. But where does this tolerance start? If construction is the translation of ideas into reality, then perhaps we need to already start with this philosophy all the way at the beginning, all the way with the concept. Perhaps we need to develop concepts that are robust enough to not be affected by these contingencies. In the last couple of years, we've been very lucky in our office by being able to complete a series of institutional projects, including a secondary school in Rapperswil-Jona, and also the Research Institute in Lausanne that I'm going to be presenting today. And in these public buildings where we face changing pedagogies, limited budgets, and diverse and often conflicting demands, the needs for a robustness that absorbs these types of contingencies and that allows the building to evolve become more important. So we're interested in a robustness in architecture that's not defined through a forceful imposition, but through the simple reading of the given set of conditions to produce the greatest breadth of possibilities. In particular, we're interested in how the fundamental elements of architecture, the structure, the services, all of these things that sometimes are treated in a secondary way, become spatial and organizational strategies so that one cannot be separated from the other, but rather form an integrated whole that withstands the passage of time. The Institute for Sports Sciences is a project that we won through an open competition in 2013. It's a building on the campus of the University of Lausanne that unites 4 public and private organizations researching and teaching sports sciences. And on first glance, it's a very idyllic site with amazing sweeping views of Lake Geneva, which is this kind of gray surface that's down below. So you see this backdrop of Lake Geneva and the Alps, a very, very prominent site. But the campus was characterized by buildings like these, behemoths with fortress-like plinths that really don't have much to do with the landscape that joins all of them. We were interested in offering a counterpoint, something modern and self-confident, but also not a complete rejection of the campus. Something that maybe was light and quiet, almost hovering in the landscape, but a wolf in sheep's clothing. Typologically, when you study office buildings, and most of the program was actually offices for researchers and the professors and things like that. So when you study office buildings of this size that are roughly 35 to 40 meters in depth, the typical response is to either fill the center where you don't get any daylight with a massive core, or to make a void. And in both cases, it's a little bit known, it's quite sober and expected. So we were interested in rethinking the problem of this center. We wondered what would happen if the center was both the infrastructural core as well as the rich collective experience. Conceptually, we've split the building into 2 parts, a hyper-rational and flexible ring of workspaces and a porous mass of service and shared spaces. The outer ring accepted certain conventions of office planning, the modular grid based on the facade that allowed for all the different sizes of offices that they could dream for, as well as allowing the flexibility for future repartitioning. And the depth of that ring was less than 5 meters, which allowed every workspace to have optimum daylight. This hyper-rationality freed us up to explore the core as the architectural experience. A series of alternating stacked bars creates an internal landscape. The internal mass absorbs all the spaces that don't need daylight, so physical testing labs, as well as vertical shafts, elevators, stairs, but also bathrooms and kitchens, things of that sort that serve every floor. And at the same time, it's also a kind of dynamic spatial experience and a collective heart to the project. The competition program had specifically asked for an architectural response to creating synergy between the 4 users of the building. And so for us, this internal landscape of vertical circulation could offer chance encounters and informal meetings, acting as a counterpoint to the individual private offices in the ring. So this is an image from our competition proposal. And as you make your way up, the space begins to open up in different directions with views to the different floors, but also to the outside. And the sculptural form of this kind of the rotation of the bars comes into view. The ring allows the different entities to maintain their privacy and for people to retreat into a quiet space of concentration and to choose for themselves how they would like to relate to the others. At the same time, the visual continuity between these 2 worlds means that there's a constant awareness of the others and of what's happening inside the building. Structurally, the 2 parts work together. The outer ring of lightweight plates and columns is braced by this inner core to form, again, this kind of interdependency. And at the same time, the juxtaposition of the 2 systems produces a diversity of spaces from the very grand, like this, to the very intimate. And the hierarchy of elements, the legibility of this kind of inner structural grid in white concrete, and how that meets the concrete volumes, which is in a more conventional gray concrete, were all sort of conscious decisions to underscore that initial architectural concept. Everything else was considered as infill and secondary, able to be dismounted, replaced, and recycled. The corridor is not only used for circulation, but also for the distribution of all the services inside the suspended ceiling. And of course, often the most complex moments to resolve are also the ones that are the most invisible, that nobody but the architects know. So for example, here, the shadow gaps, in this case at the edge of the atrium to the suspended ceiling along the corridor, hide the necessary smoke protection curtains that shut off the atrium in case of fire. And when we go further around along the corridor and to the other side of the concrete bars, we see into the physical testing labs, which is on your left. These are highly controlled environments where they hook the athletes up to machines and measure their heart rates and physical strain. And even here, the kind of primary and secondary systems are clearly felt, the heaviness of the concrete and the lightness of the office ring. On an ecological level, the building is also highly performative. It uses both passive and active technologies with an emphasis on the passive. So for example, heating and cooling with the renewable lake water, which is pumped through this tap system using the thermal inertia of the concrete, as well as natural ventilation through the windows. And of course, the geometry of the building itself optimizes daylight for the offices, translating into quite significant energy savings. And it's also, something where you feel quite connected with the seasons and with the environment outside. And into this kind of rationality, we also introduced moments of a kind of tactile surprise. The door handles in the building were designed together with an artist, Alois Godina. These are the simple moments where users come into physical contact with the building, where they essentially grab, a piece of the building every day. And so it's a moment of tactility and warmth. These are oiled oak handles, so they change with time and track, in a way, the kind of use of the building over time. And so from the imprecision of the rough foam models to the imprecision of the construction site lies a series of very, very precise decisions that bring a project to reality. At every step of the process, these obstacles that seek to complicate the project and challenge the kind of integrity of it force us in a way to question the kind of hierarchy of the idea and to keep it coherent. And so while construction is, of course, about bringing something to reality, it is also about the construction of a disciplinary knowledge, the construction of an idea, and the construction also of spaces that ultimately are spaces that people meet, that people live in, and where they can discover ways in which to interact. And so before I end, I'd like to show a very, very short film that we premiered last week at the Engadine Art Talks. It's a video that we were working together with two artists, Laurian Ginitoyu, who's a photographer that did all the photos also of this project, and Arata Mori, and with music by Yu Miyashita. And mainly it's because for us, construction at the end of the day is something that you have to experience physically, being in the space. And we see most of the time buildings represented to us through still images which capture only singular moments. But in fact, a building is experienced over time and is experienced in the way that we move through that space. So we always are knowing what is behind us and what comes before us, and also the kind of interdependency of that whole. So. Thank you very much.